So hello to those of us who are joining via some of the channels. We are getting ready to get launched with all of our channels as we're streaming in various places. So please do bear with us for just a few moments. We are going to be talking to a high-level profile on the Digital Services Act and whether it can be a game changer for fundamental rights. We're going to talk about principles as well as policies. So don't go away. Well, thank you very much for your patience. We are ready to get started on this Digital Services Act event. We've seen so many of these over recent months and indeed years, talking about what needs to be done to tackle some of the fundamental problems we see online. And today we're asking the questions whether the DSA will be a game changer for digital fundamental rights. Now, we're streaming via PeerTube, which is an open source video service. We'll also have it on Twitter and on Facebook, and you can please use a public chat function to ask questions. We want you to go to Slido to ask questions of our panelists. You can do that by going to your browser, slido.com or sli.do. There's no need to download anything. You can remain anonymous if you want to, but of course, we would love to hear your names if you're happy to share. You enter the code 870705. That's 870705, and that'll bring you to the event, and I'll be keeping an eye on your questions on my tablet. Keep your phone handy as well. You can use that to ask questions. But first, to outline a little bit about where we're at, what stage the whole proposal is happening at, we have our host for today's event, and that is Patrick Breyer, MEP with the Pirate Party. Patrick, I'm going to hand the floor over to you for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Jen, and a very good evening to everybody, and thank you for joining this debate on whether the upcoming Digital Services Act could be a game changer to the protection of our fundamental rights online, and on how we can bring this about. Now, the promise of the internet has always been that it should be a haven for freedom, giving everybody a voice and fostering democracy around the world. But we've seen that the reality has been that the technology is used by a few near monopolist corporations as well as governments as a weapon to pervasively record our every action, to analyze our personalities and use this knowledge against us, to let error-prone censorship machines decide on what we can say and read online. So I'm very excited to host tonight's debate on how to put fundamental rights at the center of the upcoming EU Digital Services Act, and how best to use this unique opportunity to take the power over our fundamental rights out of the hands of the corporations and place it in the hands of the people and our democratic institutions. I would like to give a brief welcome to our distinguished panelists tonight, and we'll start with my fellow colleague, the European Parliament's lead negotiator, Christel Schaldemose.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for first of all organizing this event. I find it very important, but also for inviting me to speak here. You said many good things, and I think you're right in asking many questions. The DSA, I guess, will be an opportunity to kind of take back controls from the big tech giants. They do decide the development of our society. They do set up the frame for competition between companies, and they do organize the democratic debate we have in our society. They have become public spaces, in my opinion. And therefore, I think that the DSA is an opportunity to do a lot of things to regulate this even more. And yes, often we say that the internet should not be regulated, but I do believe that what is illegal offline should also be illegal online, and the other way around. What is legal offline should also be legal online. And I therefore think that it is good that we use the DSA to hopefully get some of these things right and regulate more, so we can have a trustful online environment, and making sure that we still respect the very important freedom of speech, but at the same time also hopefully will be able to create a better trustworthy environment for many people who today don't really dare taking part of the democratic decision making. So what kind of ideas do I have? And well, I have several ideas on what we can do, but first and foremost, I do believe that the algorithms of the tech giants plays an important role in how they influences the freedom of speech and the way the way we get information and things like that. So I find it extremely important that we do more in order to regulate the algorithms. And the Commission's proposal is asking for more transparency, and transparency is definitely important. But in my opinion, it's not enough. So I think that we also need to make sure that the platforms are made accountable for how their algorithms works. And I think that they need to tell us what they want to do, and we need to be able to check whether they're doing what they're supposed to do. And moreover, the Commission should also, or we should at least have someone to look into that they are not compromising the fundamental rights in our society. I also think that it is important to look into this very aggressive advertising or harvesting of data that we see on many platforms. And one of the ways we can tackle that in the DSA would probably be to try to make a ban on the micro-targeting of advertisement. I think that could be very important to try to find a solution on. In my opinion, it's not enough just to say that we leave it up to people to give consent or not to whether they should give away their data. I think what happens is really scary, and many people don't really understand what they are doing when they are going online and use apps or other digital services. So I think that at least a stricter online advertisement regime would be needed, and hopefully a kind of ban, at least not on advertisement in general, but on this micro-targeting of advertisement. And then I think we also need to give users of the platforms more rights. Today, it is completely up to the platforms to decide, and you have to comply with the community standards. And if you don't, then you're thrown out or closed down or whatever. And I think that is dangerous in many ways in a democratic society, that it's up to the platforms to decide who will be able to speak or not. And therefore, I have suggested that we give users more rights. I have in particular suggested that we do something to protect, for instance, journalists who very often will see themselves either closed down from the platforms or at least some of their content taken down. And let me give you one specific new example from Denmark. We have a very famous Danish journalist. She has reporting from the Middle East and now from Afghanistan. And she used her Instagram account to show how Taliban was celebrating when they took over the airport of Kabul. And she was closed down with this content. She was not supporting it. She was just reporting about what took place. And she was her content was closed down. I think that we need to discuss how we can avoid that the platforms decide whether a journalist can do their job or not. And therefore, I think that we need to look into to give some specific types of interest more room for not being taken down. So I think that we can do something with the DSA to create to make sure that we deliver on fundamental rights. It will probably not solve all the problems we have in the world or in the digital world, but I hope that the DSA will be a step in the right direction. And we should not be afraid of regulating. We should not be afraid of taking back control. As Patrick said, I think we need politicians, the democratic system, to make decisions about how the platforms should work. It should not just be up to commercial interest, especially not because they have such a huge impact on our society. I'm looking very much forward to the debate today and to the questions, and I will sit here and take notes myself also in order to be inspired. We will negotiate the whole after autumn in order to find the Parliament's position on the DSA, and hopefully in the springtime we will be able to have the trilogue with the French presidency. And my aim is to make sure that before the summer break next year that we will have finalized the political agreement around the DSA. But let's see, it's my wish. I'm not sure whether that will be the case or not, but I will work for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christelle, and we know you are working hard on it, so of course, please do let me know if you have questions yourself for our great panelists. And with that, I am going to introduce you to the panel. We have representing the Commission, we have Werner Steng from the Cabinet of Commissioner Vestager. We have David Reichel, who is in the Data and Research Unit of the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency. Christophe Schmon is the International Policy Coordinator for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And last but not least, she probably needs no introduction. Of course, we have Professor Shoshana Zuboff, who is a Harvard economist and the author of Surveillance Capitalism. Thank you all very much for joining us at different times of day and night around the world. I really appreciate you all taking the time. We're going to go through each of you in turn, let you sort of introduce yourselves, set out your stall, and give us your position on what you think is going to happen with the DSA and what should happen and what needs to be held in mind for the future of this policy. Werner, I will start with you. You've about 5 to 7 minutes there to lay out where you think things are going.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for organizing this event. Indeed, I would argue this is a game changer, the DSA. It is adapting our regulatory framework to this to today's internet, when it's largely replacing the e-commerce directive, which is 20 years old. And if you think back what the internet looked like in the year 2000, we had Google in its infancy. Amazon was largely a book retailer. There were no social media, no Facebook, no YouTube, none of the marketplaces that we know today. So it was a different planet we were living on. Even 10 years later, when I was first made responsible for the e-commerce directive, 2010, 2011, we did a paper or a communication on online services and around the e-commerce directive. And we did not mention platforms, online platforms once. So it's only 10 years back, and it was not so much on the agenda. Today, we are talking platforms all the time. So the DSA is a game changer, the first law of its kind globally, although the topics the issues that we are addressing, of course, are felt everywhere and discussed everywhere. But we seem to be the first one coming with a comprehensive regulatory response. And as such, obviously, we also have some responsibility because we're likely to set some global standards here, as we did with the GDPR. Now, the problem in doing preparing the DSA is that there are so many interests at stake. There's nobody left, I guess, on this planet who is not somehow concerned by the activities of online platforms or digital companies, even beyond online platforms. So we had to balance out so many different things. But the first balance was already that we do, of course, want to address the phenomenon of illegal content, which has proliferated, obviously, in the last few years. And it's very diverse in nature, as we all know, from unsafe products to child pornographic material, to terrorism, to hate speech, to copyright infringements, what have you, a vast range of different types of challenges. At the same time, equally important for us, we want to make sure that legal content stays online. Patrick started out by saying that the internet was meant to place of freedom of expression, of democracy. Very, very important for us that fundamental rights are upheld, freedom of expression is upheld. So absolutely at the center of this paper. The second one was sort of to strike a balance between protection of users, of citizens, if you want, with the due diligence obligations, but also innovation and the benefits that arise from the platform economy. We lawmakers, we tend to focus on the problems, illegal content here, illegal content there, but obviously there's many companies that are vibrant in this space, many users of such companies, many consumers that benefit from such companies. So we need to strike the right balance between protection and innovation. And thirdly, and this was strongly mentioned by Patrick and Christelle, it is sort of private versus public behavior. We're talking about privately owned companies that have obtained a quasi-public role. And one objective of this Digital Services Act is indeed to regain democratic control over processes that over time have largely been privatized. And the digital companies, digital platforms have become gateways to information, to content, to products, to services. As such matchmakers, if you want, they have also brought lots of benefits. So once again, it's not black and white. There are matchmakers that have increased efficiency tremendously. And the ease with which I can now find a hotel in an area where I need a hotel compared to what I was doing 10 or 20 years back is enormous. But then also we have the opacity that came with it, the market power that came with it, the use of algorithms, the data that are centralized in a few companies, the misalignment of interests, which was also already mentioned, whether it's surveillance capitalism, the proliferation of content for the attention economy, where it's not so much whether information is in the public interest of high quality, but that it is shared as much as possible to attract advertising income, clicks, whether it's self-preferencing that is done, but also even the abuse of platforms and such business models to undermine our entire democracy and elections. So there's lots of challenges out there. We tried to address them in the most balanced way possible, and I'm very much looking forward to more detailed questions and the lively debate around those issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Werner. A whistle-stop tour there from where we were back 20 years ago to where we are now with the current proposal. So thank you for that. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions for you. We'll turn now to David. David, you are obviously representing Fundamental Rights Agency. Give us your take on what you think could be achievable with the DSA.
Great. Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting panel discussion. At the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, we very much welcome the important initiative of the DSA as it addresses some of the most pressing challenges of our times. I think everyone agrees here. We also note, of course, the many discussions around the DSA in relation to fundamental rights at the European Parliament, at the Council, and in many other fora. The EDPS, for example, civil society organizations, as well as others working on the protection of fundamental rights, made important contributions to the discussions around the DSA. At the agency, we carried out several research projects on topics that are relevant to the DSA discussions, such as on artificial intelligence, on hate crime, and on data protection. This year, we started a new project on online content moderation, where we focus directly on questions linked to digital services and fundamental rights, and in relation to moderating online hatred in EU member states. Our research aims to inform policy discussions right now, of course, but also going beyond the adoption of the DSA. In this intervention, I would like to focus on selected aspects, which are mainly informed by FRA's research in these areas. As someone working on research and looking at the topics of the DSA, I'm tempted to state one of the most dreaded conclusions someone can make for policymakers. More research is needed. However, this does not mean that more research is needed for the DSA, but rather that the DSA is needed to allow for better research, for better scrutiny and oversight to take place. And this is what the DSA is aiming for in some of its provisions. As we heard before, the area is still relatively new, and this means we have to increase our understanding of actual risks and how to deal with these risks. We need to create a framework to scrutinize and assess risks to fundamental rights. And this way, it's particularly welcome to see the risk assessment in relation to fundamental rights addressed in the DSA. Risk assessments are a crucial tool to increase our understanding in this rather complex area. The fundamental rights mentioned in Article 26 of the DSA, they cover the main aspects linked to fundamental rights and digital services. However, it is in general important to remember that other fundamental rights are also potentially impacted, especially because fundamental rights are very often interlinked with each other and also interdependent. To mention a few: freedom of thought, freedom of assembly, freedom of arts and sciences, equality between men and women is a very crucial topic also for digital services. Also important to mention, the use of digital services also has positive impacts on fundamental rights. For example, it can foster assembly and association of people, it can foster arts and sciences and so forth. Yet obviously, we all agree there are also many major risks involved. In our research on artificial intelligence, for example, we found that companies who use artificial intelligence algorithms for their business, including those involved in targeted advertising, are often not aware of different fundamental rights risks, such as discrimination, for example. An important question in this relation is how such risk assessments are then carried out when assessing the impact on different fundamental rights. On discrimination, companies sometimes assume that if there's no explicit information on some protected characteristics, such as gender or age, included in the data sets that are used for creating algorithms, then there will be no discrimination. And we already know that this is not necessarily true. Discrimination can occur in many ways, particularly given the potentially large amount of information which is processed via online platforms, and they can quite easily link to any of the protected characteristics included in Article 21 of the Charter. So online spaces are more unsafe for certain vulnerable groups, which we need to protect better. The DSA proposal pays also specific attention to freedom of expression and information. It's important to underscore the importance of preserving the prohibition of general monitoring, which is included in the proposal. It is also important to recognize that the right to freedom of expression is not absolute. It may be restricted on several grounds and balanced with other fundamental rights to foster a safe and online environment. And there are a lot of discussions around this from freedom of expression point of view, which are important to note. For example, how clearly illegal content is defined, how precautionary overblocking by platforms, but also potentially underblocking, can be avoided or at least mitigated, and the extent to which companies can make their own proper assessments of illegal content. Without entering these debates, I would like to highlight that the transparency requirements in the DSA are crucial for the success of proper risk assessment and mitigation, to understand whether interferences with fundamental rights are indeed necessary and proportionate. So it's very welcome to see the introduction of concrete measures to increase the transparency. These requirements complement data protection requirements with respect to automated decision-making, for example, and then they can really help to get more clarity on how recommender systems and targeted advertising works in practice. On the one hand, the required transparency in terms and conditions are really important. For us, Fundamental Rights Survey found that 27% of those reading terms and services when using online services actually don't understand them. So a major effort is needed to get those right. However, 1 in 3 online service users in the EU never read terms and conditions. What is more, only 60% of people in the EU have heard about the right to opt out from direct marketing. And this, on the other hand, makes oversight and risk assessment even more relevant. When it comes to accessing information about how online platforms work, more transparency is better than less. The information and access of information required under the DSA needs to allow for an independent oversight, independent research, and access to an effective remedy and judicial redress, which requires all parties to have information relevant for a dispute. So these are just a few general observations of DSA-related discussions from fundamental rights perspective. The DSA is necessarily a very complex regulation with still many discussions ongoing. And these discussions will extend beyond the adoption of the DSA and are highly relevant for the proper implementation. I see the DSA as an important instrument that is much needed starting point to provide a framework for observing digital services that allows states and governments to follow their duty to protect fundamental rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. As you said, there's an awful lot of different moving parts involved in fundamental rights, as they are complementary and sometimes there must be balances struck between them. So we will no doubt delve into that in more detail. I already see questions coming in from our audience, so please do keep those coming. I'm going to turn now to Christoph. Christoph, you have experience here in Brussels. You're now at EFF. You can really talk to the international dimension of why the DSA is important. So I'll hand over the floor to you now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer, for the nice introduction, and thanks, Patrick, for having me today. I would like to start off by stating the obvious, which is that the Digital Services Act is extremely ambitious. Unlike the e-commerce directive, it goes much beyond a rough framework for platforms to participate in the EU internal market. If you look at the DSA scope, you see it wants to regulate almost everything in terms of service enforcement, content moderation, takedowns, trusted flaggers, platform oversight, procedural justice, and many other matters. And we think it's a good approach. We need to be ambitious because much has changed over the last 20 years. Werner said it right. It was a different world back then. What we see now is that more and more users are non-consensually tracked across the internet. And we see that a few powerful platforms have built up those large walls that make it so difficult for users to switch if they're unhappy. And this is some sort of ongoing transformation from an open internet to a rather closed one. And that comes with a real challenge and along with so many negative effects of use for users. Surveillance capitalism, amplification of hate speech, and many other things. So the question is now how to regulate all that without breaking things. For this reason, EFF, which is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and many other civil society groups, we have made suggestions from the start on how to effect a reform that would focus on the protection of fundamental rights. We would like to empower users rather than platforms, and we think that users should be more in control over their online experience. That's perhaps one of the most important additions by the Digital Services Act proposal, that there is an acknowledgement in there that platforms make mistakes. Platforms make mistakes all the time. So we need transparency measures, we need procedural remedies, such as to see our content reinstated if it was taken down by mistake. And we know that those content takedowns often go to the detriment of the most marginalized and vulnerable groups. There are other things the Commission got right, like to preserve the values that kept the internet free, such as the idea that it's unacceptable to mandate the monitoring of what users say or share online. On the other hand, we are rather upset to see that the proposal missed the mark on other key issues that are so important for the protection of digital rights online. I would only like to mention two because there isn't enough time for me to unpack all of them. But one issue relates to the issue of trust, and the other one relates to the issue of power. If we think of trust, then we see that the Digital Services Act made the conscious decision to put a lot of trust in law enforcement authorities and industry-oriented entities. They should act as trusted flaggers, for example, for problematic content. And their flagging should have priority. We see the same thing in the European Parliamentary report, the draft report, that also suggests that platforms should rank in recommender systems information from law enforcement authorities higher than other content. We do understand the intention behind that, but would also like to warn about the risk if this doesn't come with civil rights guarantees. Think about forced deprioritization of content shared by human rights activists. And at the same token, we kind of miss a strong commitment that we cannot trust platforms to be in charge to decide over what is permitted or illegal online. In our opinion, it should be up to independent judges to make that call. Unfortunately, we see that the Digital Services Act puts a lot of trust that platforms will use, I guess, an army of in-house teams of lawyers to check every piece of content, and platforms are supposed to be capable to assess whether a court would then find that piece of content illegal. We know that this is not going to happen. Platforms act economically rational, at least they're supposed to act economically rational. And so the easiest way for them to avoid liability will be to remove as much problematic content as possible. And we have learned this lesson the hard way from recent bad copyright bills, and would like to avoid the same mistake in the DSA. So our call on the Parliament would be, don't follow the same footsteps of recent disastrous internet bills, or flirt with ideas to introduce very short removal obligations, as this would have an enormous impact on freedom of expression rights. And there's another trust issue when we look at the provision on how to assess and mitigate systemic risk. So the DSA trusts that platforms will self-assess the risk properly that occur on the platforms, and they will take the right measures. We believe that to some extent it's naive to think that platforms are going to do this properly, and that we don't see any requirement that such measures must be necessary in a democratic society. Pretty much was what pointed out by the previous speaker. We believe it's very important to have a stronger focus on the human rights impact assessment, which should be a real legal obligation rather than a wish, or rather than something that is expressed by recitals. That's one thing. When turning to the other issue I mentioned, the issue of power, we see that the European Commission did not go quite the last mile to actually change the power dynamics in the platform economy. The question is, like, how ambitious do we want to be? Do we really want to change the current business practices, the current ecosystem user space? If so, then we would need to think of measures that let businesses being actually concerned that users leave, that they switch to another platform if they're unhappy with the service. This can work out if, for example, we tackle much stronger the current surveillance system that users face, the targeted ad system. Or that can work out if users don't have to abandon their social relationship if they want to switch platforms. This could be affected through rules on interoperability that enable users to communicate across platform boundaries. Or already the mere possibility that users could switch at any point in time would incentivize platforms to treat existing users better and perhaps give them more agency over their online experience. I think I need to finish up, but I want to conclude with a reminder that the European Union needs to consider its global leadership role on protecting human rights. We are now in a very critical stage of the lawmaking process, and we think that we can easily break things if we don't get it right now. So it should be rewarding for the European Parliament, for the European Commission and the Council to also listen to non-European groups and civil society members. They often haven't had a chance to voice their perspective, and we believe that they have plenty of experience to share that opinions and expression and opinions that are worth to be heard. So that would be our call for the Parliament to consider the international impact and include non-European groups and other civil society members. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Indeed, one of our comments coming in from the audience was saying, isn't it up to the courts to determine what is illegal? So I think we'll get into that in a bit more detail in due course. I'm going to hand the floor over now to Shoshana Zuboff, a professor who has coined the phrase surveillance capitalism and one of the leading voices internationally to sound the alarm on this issue. Thank you very much, Shoshana. We're really, really delighted to have you here and to have your input into what we need to do with the Digital Services Act here in Europe. So please take all the time you need to give us your thoughts on the matter.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you, Patrick, for convening the meeting, and Christelle and all of the amazing colleagues on this panel. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to join this discussion today at another critical point in the consideration of the Digital Services Act, which I agree with everything that has been said around the notion that this can be a game changer. And I will add to that, we cannot afford for it not to be a game changer. So where are we now? You know, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the harms inflicted by corporate power were understood as restricted to the economic domain, where they fell upon workers, consumers, competitors. But the harms of corporate power and market dominance in the digital century are no longer only economic. They are social, the product of a born digital economic logic that I have called surveillance capitalism. Why do I call it that? Well, because surveillance capitalism maintains core elements of traditional capitalism, private property, market exchange, growth and profit, but these cannot be realized without the technologies and social relations of surveillance. That means that hidden methods of observation invade and capture personal experience, which is redefined as raw material for the massive scale extraction of human generated data. These stolen data are then claimed as the corporation's private property, available for manufacture and sales. So data travel to computational factories, where they're computed into behavioral predictions, and finally sold to business customers in a new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively in predictive knowledge of human behavior. Surveillance capitalists sell the promise of certainty, and that promise requires data extraction and computation at an unprecedented and therefore really unimaginable scale. Surveillance economics has birthed a new breed of corporate institutions that now own and operate the internet, mediating all action. I'll repeat that, mediating all action that engages its ubiquitous architectures. Its social harms do not fall only on workers and consumers, but on users. And users are all of us. We all sit in its crosshairs. So we are here today because the social harms that flow from surveillance economics cannot be shoehorned into Cinderella's 20th century legal glass slipper, which was conceived to eliminate or mitigate economic harms under profoundly different conditions of existence than those in which we live today. In an information civilization, principles of social order derive from the essential questions of knowledge, authority, and power as they pertain to information. If you can't remember what I just said, remember it this way. 3 questions. Who knows? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides who knows? Knowledge, authority, and power. The problem now, my friends, is that the corporate surveillance empires now hold the answers to each of these questions, though we did not elect them to govern. On the strength of their property claims to our data, the private surveillance empires have mounted a fundamentally anti-democratic epistemic coup. This is a revolutionary takeover of knowledge and knowing. They decide what is known. They decide who can know it and to what purpose. The epistemic coup is a unitary process that proceeds in 4 stages of attack: rights, equality, social solidarity, and governance. Listen, each stage is a demonstration of economic cause and social harm effects. These causes and effects are not sui generis, but they are moments in a single process. Each stage develops the conditions and builds the scaffolding for the next. The harms that emerge at each stage are enabled by, depend upon, and integrate what went before. Briefly, stage 1 lays the foundation for all that follows. The causal action here is the illegitimate, massive scale extraction of human-generated data. The meaning of that causal action is the violation of elemental rights to sovereign knowledge of one's own experience. By elemental rights, I mean rights that we have taken for granted as a feature of normal life, rights that have not yet been translated into law. These epistemic rights are also decision rights, including the right to decide what of my experience is shared, with whom is it shared, and for what purpose, and thus to decide what remains private. Data extraction usurps epistemic rights without penalty. The wholesale destruction of individual privacy that has occurred over the last 2 decades is a social harm effect of this cause, the massive scale extraction of human-generated data without penalty. Stage 2 builds on extraction and is defined by the corporate concentration of knowledge about individuals in society. The social harm effect is a new axis of epistemic inequality, understood as the difference between what I can know and what can be known about me, as epistemic rights are concentrated in the corporate domain. Stage 3 builds on extraction and its resulting concentrations of knowledge to engineer targeting mechanisms that maximize engagement as the means to maximize the scale and scope of extraction. And the aim here is to produce more competitive behavioral predictions. Without going into detail, the key point is that algorithms engineered for this purpose have a documented tendency to amplify the most corrupt, bizarre, dangerous, and defactualized information content. Look, all societies produce such content at their margins. The difference now is that surveillance capitalism's economic imperatives work to normalize toxic content and drive it to the center stage of social media discourse, instead of ignoring it at the fringe where it belongs and where it would remain in a society that was not mediated by surveillance capitalism. In other words, the public sphere has become a commercial sphere as these economic operations intermediate information flows and unravel the sociological rationale that has been implicit in the right to freedom of expression since the 18th century. The social harm effect of this cause is the profit-driven escalation of what I call epistemic chaos. This takes the form of disinformation, misinformation, polarizing speech, radicalizing speech, hate speech, and so on. The degradation of the information space leads to social splintering, the alienation of individuals from society, the weakening of democratic processes and institutions. And now finally, stage 4 exploits these conditions with increasingly aggressive shows of epistemic dominance. This is where the surveillance empires vie with democracy over the fundamental rights and legal principles that govern our societies. And they do this by leveraging their absolute control and unaccountable power over critical information systems and infrastructures. The ultimate aim here is to substitute their information systems for society and to substitute their computational governance for democracy. We are here today because the work of democratic lawmakers now is and must be counter-revolution. As the European Parliament debates the Digital Services Act and ultimately the Digital Markets Act, the world looks to you, I look to you, to retake the societal frontier in the name of a democratic counter-revolution. The theory of surveillance capitalism can simplify, unify, and clarify the legislative challenges before you. And so my final goal in these remarks is to identify specific opportunities. First, the understanding of surveillance capitalism's foundations and revolutionary action simplifies our causal understanding of social harms. The illegitimate extraction of personal data is the bed of sand upon which the entire economic edifice and its social harms are founded. Instead, we have focused downstream. We have focused on downstream issues of content moderation, of what is legal or illegal, all of which assume the inevitability of extraction. But Occam's razor suggests that the efficient and effective lawmaking that we demand today must focus upstream at the source. And that means outlawing surveillance-based data extraction and its related practices that coerce extraction as the price of social and economic participation. The focus on data extraction is linked to the civilization-defining requirement for juridical epistemic rights. The EU took an early leadership position on this question with the 2014 decision to assert the right to be forgotten as a fundamental principle of European law. It's interesting that then in 2014, Google's CEO Eric Schmidt characterized the court's decision as, quote, a balance that was struck wrong in the collision between a right to be forgotten and a right to know. But the decision was never one of balancing two conflicting goods. That decision redistributed a single good. The right to be forgotten does not stand in opposition to a right to know. It is a right to know. The court in 2014 returned to the people this fundamental, sovereign, epistemic right to know one's past and to decide who knows. Article 26 of the Digital Services Act holds companies accountable for the social harms that are violations of fundamental rights. This is the moment in the material and cultural development of our information civilization when epistemic rights must finally become an explicitly codified domain of fundamental rights as a bulwark against data extractivism and the anti-democratic social harms that follow in its wake. All right, following on this simplification, we also see with the theory of surveillance capitalism a grasp of the stages of the epistemic coup that unifies our understanding of the social harms that are thrown off in each phase of development. The democratic response has been undermined by a tendency to treat these harms as discrete and distinct problems. We have siloed and fragmented our understanding and our solutions. Surveillance capitalism provides a unified theory of what have appeared to be unrelated harms: privacy, disinformation, corporate power. These are not distinct problems. They are simply different stages of a single process. And no one of them would be possible without the original sin of illicit data extraction. Finally, all that I have spoken to clarifies the driving force behind each of these social harms and the links between them. Surveillance economics and its imperatives. This is the driving force. Surveillance economics is capitalism's digital century iron cage. I want to echo some comments that Christoph made by emphasizing surveillance capitalism and its economic iron cage will not give way to ethical persuasion and niceties. It will not give way to personal pleas or polite pressure for voluntary action and compliance. Law is what's necessary, but law is still not sufficient. If you design and pass good laws, you must also ensure the funding and capabilities to enforce those laws. My friends, if we have learned anything from the GDPR, it is that great law without committed, unrelenting, muscular enforcement only strengthens the surveillance empires, their audacity, their lobbyists, and their litigators. This task cannot be underestimated. Democratic power is the only countervailing force capable of taming the tech empires, but it will require centralized regulatory authority and funding in creative new forms of collaboration with member states. We are here today because 20 years ago, we entered a new age. And yet, 20 years later, the world's liberal democracies have still failed to construct a coherent political vision of a digital century that advances democratic principles and government. It is this failure that left the void that has been filled by surveillance capitalism. History has now put you, members of the European Parliament, at this crossroads, where only a bold and resourceful democratic counter-revolution can guarantee the continuity of humanity's most breathtaking, humane, and ambitious idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A really intensive lesson for many of us that we can take away a lot of those points. And I think it will inform a lot of our discussion. Now, I was wanting to look at three particular main topics with regard to the DSA. Firstly, identification for services and indeed the right to remain anonymous in the use of those same services. A second area we want to maybe briefly touch on as well, given that time is tight, is upload filtering, of course, or the general monitoring obligation. This is something that has been very controversial. And finally, platform lock-in or the lack of interoperability, because we do want to see that it allows people, if they can move away and move between platforms, less dependency on a single platform. So those are the kind of key areas, but I see so many questions coming in from our audience that I'm going to jump straight to those. I want to mention, as Stefan had said, he took the example of MasterCard forcing change at Pornhub, whether or not these big digital payment systems from the US should actually be de facto gatekeepers in the EU. So I think he's there making a reference to and backing up Shoshana's point on power and who decides. But I want to take as our first question to the panel one from Adeline Brion from Lie Detectors, who asks, how can we move away from the content-based approach when tackling disinformation? The emphasis on fact-checking creates dependence on platforms. You can see the question there on your screen. I think for this one, perhaps I will ask Christoph for your thoughts on that first.
Hi. It's a very good question. I just read it again because I see it on the Q&A. Yes, I mean, the issue of fact-checking is a problematic one, because it's, again, the question of trust, right? Who can we trust? Who's capable of determining which information is disinformation, which information is wrongful information, which information is factual? We would support an approach that considers fact-checking by independent researchers, perhaps by victims' organization, by those who are actually in touch with users and their rights, rather than thinking it's a good idea then that those who hold the power of enforcement, like police services and Interpol, or those who represent the interest of industry stakeholders like copyright entities, are those who should be trusted to make those calls about which kind of content should be removed or not. So that would be our call: focus on independent vetted researchers, focus on those who are in touch with victims of hate speech, and make sure that the power imbalance between those who already hold power, like corporate entities, and users are not shifted in their favor by introducing an option to actually declare those companies being equipped to make those calls about what is illegal, what is or permitted online. We don't think that this is a good idea.
Werner, let me turn to you and ask you your reaction to Shoshana's comments regarding on the problems regarding the big economic gatekeepers and what can be done to dismantle our reliance on them, and whether that is something you feel is within the scope and within the remit of the DSA.
Did you address this question to me? Because the third word, okay, yeah, I did.
Yes.
Yeah. Partially you've already answered it yourself when you said that this is not just about the DSA, and also Shoshana herself referred to the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, at the same time. And I would add to that probably other initiatives that we have tabled at the beginning of this mandate already, whether it was platform-based like DSA, DMA, whether it was technology-based like artificial intelligence, whether it is linked to a proposal on a European identity where people would have means of identifying themselves without using the identification means provided by private companies, right? If I want to identify myself at the airport to get free Wi-Fi, why would I have to use a Google or Facebook identity if I have a trustworthy e-identity myself? But also the the Data Governance Act also tries to make sure that when data is shared, collected, and so on, that this is done in a trustworthy way. So it's a whole package of initiatives which jointly, I think, will have this effect on limiting the power of so-called gatekeeper platforms. Because on many things that Shoshana mentioned, of course, the DSA is super relevant, but I would say the Digital Market Act is equally relevant. When data collected in one or through one service, one platform core service, cannot just be transferred to another part of that empire in order, to fuel another line of trade of that company. And there's many other data-related elements there. So I really think we should watch the whole Monty here.
Jennifer, can I make one tiny comment on that? Werner, I agree with you so strongly, and I just wanted to emphasize that I am thinking about the various legislative dimensions. Of course, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, but also the GDPR, because I think in order to accomplish the things that I'm emphasizing here in my remarks, it will take not only these three legislative programs and regulatory paradigms, but it will take the muscular enforcement of all three. And if we can imagine a world in which all three of these regulatory frameworks are actually enforced and funded with the full resources and capabilities that requires, then the goals that I'm pointing to in my remarks are indeed achievable, relevant, and and fulfill that promise of being the game changer legislative efforts that we're all looking for.
Thank you. I think, of course, the question about enforcement, particularly with regard to the GDPR, is another panel or another full conference for another day. It's something that's come up a lot. But I also wanted to ask then, David, we have a question coming in. How can we better reflect the mutual relationship of fundamental rights in the DSA? And perhaps you could tackle indeed that first point that I raised in our topic areas about the right to anonymity.
Thank you.
The question there on screen, we'll come to that one next. If you could just first of all deal with the question regarding fundamental rights.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you very much. It's so exciting to listen to the co-panelists on these important topics. And I continue with what we heard before on Shoshana, also when you speak about anonymity online, and that in fact, I think what we see in the DSA very nicely complements what we also have in the GDPR. I mean, the GDPR already governs a big deal of how we can share and how our data are treated online. But then also in relation to different fundamental rights, what I like about the DSA in the risk assessment is mentioning these other rights. To give you an example, when it comes to automated content or the use of algorithms in Article 22 of the GDPR, it usually refers to significant impact of people or a legal impact of people. And when people consider, for example, when you see ads online or some information online, this one incident of seeing a strange ad may not be considered a significant harm. But if we read then this in relation to risk assessments in Article 26 of the DSA, where we also speak about non-discrimination, I think this is really the area where the DSA can then tackle the systemic risks, where we can have to start forcing the companies to give us the data to assess in detail, like what does it make of a difference if every day you see a different ad, if men see different ads than women when it comes to job adverts. This is societal impact, which does not appear as a big harm in one incident, but on the larger scale. And here I really think, especially because this is powered through very complicated algorithms, that it's not to accept that this is very complicated. And I see the discussion of people have to show what parameters are used. And then I already hear technical people saying, oh, there are millions of parameters. It's really difficult to understand. And here I think it's really crucial in the assessment that this is not to accept. It's relatively not easy, but it's possible to understand how these systems work. We have in our AI research, for example, listed a few questions that can be addressed in such risk assessments. You start with, and that's what we heard before, what's the purpose? What is algorithms used to optimize for? And once we have a good answer to this, we can already continue to what data are you using to optimize for, and so forth. So I'm really thinking that based on what we have in the GDPR, we can build here further to understand the societal risks. And the last sentence, of course, the GDPR, as also the EDPS mentioned, is important not to be used for companies not to share data. I think it's really the duty to share the data because there are always ways in accessing data for research purposes in a GDPR compliant way.
Certainly. I mean, I don't want to get too much into the depth of the GDPR today. We want to try and stay future focused on the DSA. And of course, you did mention that right regarding the AI not to make significant decisions determining people. But there may also be discussions about what AI can do determining content, where that doesn't have a significant impact that you can directly point to a significant harm in people's lives. However, I'm going to turn to Patrick now. Patrick, I think I was asking about the right to anonymity as well. Would you going to bring in some points on that, please?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Indeed, you mentioned the case of payment systems as gatekeepers that simply cut off their services to certain providers and therefore remove them from the landscape. And this is something that has also hit dissidents before, and the governments are also using it, for example, to block the bank accounts of dissident movements such as Alexei Navalny's in Russia. And that's where one of the proposals of my Civil Liberties Committee comes in, which proposes that the DSA should provide for the right to use and pay for digital services anonymously wherever this is reasonably feasible. So this means that if you have an anonymous way to pay for these services, it'll of course no longer be possible to cut off certain people randomly and arbitrarily. So this is in line with the data minimization, because it means that your data won't be lost and disclosed in an unauthorized way, as we experience almost every day. It'll prevent identity theft and other forms of abuse of personal data by not collecting this data in the first place.
Thank you, Patrick. I mean, data minimization, of course, the principle is enshrined in the GDPR, but enforcing it does seem to be a bit tougher. So, Werner, how can we be confident that whatever the DSA does turn out to be in the end, that enforcement will be available there within the current systems we have, or will we need to create new bodies in order to see that these rights and rights of human rights and are upheld with regard to some of the more controversial parts of the DSA?
Well, you're perfectly right that enforcement is absolute key, and we always say that, but this time we seriously mean it, because probably the lack of enforcement in this case was even one of the drivers for the DSA in the first place. It's not just that we propose a new law and then we say, of course, this needs to be enforceable. That's normal. But in this case, a lot of things have been illegal for a long, long time, but it has just been very difficult in the online world to go after those that are behind the proliferation of such illegal activities, right? And that's also when the member states started to challenge the country of origin principle and saying, well, we can't trust this whole universe and so on. So enforceability has become absolute key. I don't know whether such background noise, am I just me hearing this, then it's fine. Okay, so enforceability is absolute key. It's equally difficult because we are, of course, building on existing structures. We cannot create new enforcement bodies that would capture the whole universe of illegality, right? Because it could be anything, as I said at the beginning, and you would, for products, you would always have market surveillance authorities. For terrorism, you would have law enforcement. For hate speech, you would have yet other bodies, and so on and so forth. So we have to make sure that the existing bodies get the appropriate powers, that they also get the capacity. And David said something very pertinent here. If we empower authorities to enforce something, they also have to be capable of doing so. If we say you have to check the algorithm or whether an AI or other algorithm meets certain requirements, well, you've got to have the human resources and the knowledge that enables you to do that in the first place. So we must do capacity building. We must connect different authorities, enforcement bodies, because they will all look at the same phenomena from different areas. And we must connect national with EU-wide enforcement mechanisms. So there is still a lot of thought to be given as to how this can be done most effectively.
Thank you. Well, I know we started a little bit late, so if everyone is agreeable with this, we could continue until at least 7:30. So with that in mind, however, there's still a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and go through them a bit more quickly. And for this one, I'm just going to ask panelists for a show of hands. One of our audience members has asked, which of the speakers would endorse the statement that what is legal offline should be legal online? We often talk about what's illegal offline, but let's talk about what's legal. Hands, can I get a show of hands? And I know there's going to be caveats and a maybe in there. So, okay. Yeah, it's all right. Sitting, okay, see, some of you sitting on the fence. We'll explore this as we go forward. But speaking of legality, Christoph, I know you wanted to answer the question that was put in by another member of our audience, asking, isn't it up to the courts to determine what is illegal? How can companies render all the variables of what makes content legal or illegal?
Of course,
excuse me, I think.
Did you ask me or Christoph?
We have a very similar first name, and I think this is the confusion.
Sorry, Christelle, I was asking that of Christoph, but I would be very happy to hear your views. Christoph, perhaps you can go first, and then I'll come back to you, Christelle.
All right. I think the hesitancy to raise arms was because, it really much depends. Which law is decisive to explain what is illegal or illegal content? what may be illegally in Germany may be perfectly legal in Belgium. And that's one of the issues that the Digital Services Act, of course, leaves it to national states to decide about that question. And to answer the question of the user, of course, it's up to judges, courts to decide about illegal content, but it's up to platforms to remove it. And this is the entire problem between private and public actors that you had mentioned before, Jennifer. And for those spectators who don't know that, in the European Union, platforms can be held liable for illegal content if they don't remove it once they become aware of the illegality. And that's the big question. As of when would a platform obtain such positive knowledge? As EFF, we would support an approach that platforms, say for exceptions for manifest illegal content types, but that such knowledge is only obtained through orders by an independent judicial authority. For us, it should be independent judges that are democratically backed up to make those calls, not some platforms that are not even domiciled in the European Union. How would they know? And this is something where we see a second problem that's attached to that. Even assuming that platforms would know whether content is illegal or legal in the specific member state, where does the platform need to remove the content? Only within the territories of that country, in the European Union, or in the entire world? And those sort of questions need to be discussed in the European Parliament, and they should be normatively clarified in the Digital Services Act. And we see that those questions are open questions, and that will lead to huge legal uncertainty. And we are afraid that platforms may tend to over-remove content worldwide. And of course, you can imagine the devastating impact on freedom of expression rights if this were the case.
Well, in answer to your second question, there is, of course, some jurisprudence already on the domain question, particularly with regard to whether it's google.com, google.fr, with regard to the right to be forgotten. So there's a little bit of work already started on that. Christelle, do you want to jump in, give your reaction to what you're hearing so far? I know you were mostly in listening mode, but we'd love to hear your thoughts.
No, I do apologize for before I couldn't hear that you asked, Christoph. Well, I just wanted to say that, of course, by the end of the day, it's up to the court to rule whether what is legal or illegal. But I also think that we need to understand that politicians need to make legislation that is understandable and that is possible to work after, because by the end of the day, it's also politicians who are the lawmakers. So I think that we have an obligation also at EU level to make sure that we make a legislation that is easily understandable, or when it comes to the member states, that they do the same, so it's easier to comply with. And we do that in many areas. We have a legislation. We expect companies in many areas to comply, even though there sometimes will be discussions about how you interpret different things. And I think that will go for this as well. So, of course, by the end of the day, it's the courts, but we also need to understand that we play a role in order to make this work in a good manner. However, if I could say just one thing, Jennifer, because I think that when I listen to the debate, I also tend to fear that because it's so difficult and because we will not leave it up to the companies, that we end up not doing anything, that we end up don't regulating, because it's so complicated and it's difficult, and it's difficult to do anything. And I fear that we end up in doing a lot of good things, do nothing, because it's complicated. And we will definitely not leave it to the platforms, and we will definitely not leave it to the politicians, and etc., etc. So I think that we also need to understand that we have a chance to do something. We need to try, we need to do our best, we need to find the right balances. We need definitely to do something about this economy, surveillance, capitalism. I agree on that, and therefore we have a lot of things to do on data. But we should not be afraid of saying this is legal and this is not legal, in order to make sure that there is a frame for the platforms to work inside. So I hope that we can find and strike the right balance in the Parliament, at least to begin with, and then hopefully also to convince the Council later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Christelle. I want to draw together a few strands and a few questions, because there's so many coming in that I think we don't have time to tackle them all individually. But I want to raise this question of flagging content, and flagging particularly illegal content. June Lowry has raised the concept of trusted flaggers, particularly in the fight against online sexual abuse material. But then also we have another comment asking whether if there is such a vast amount of content, whether AI might not be a realistic way of managing the volume of content. But then, of course, Patrick, I'm sure you will raise the point that that could stray into the territory of general monitoring, in which every single bit of content is filtered or subject to filters. So perhaps, Patrick, you could talk about that, the difference about why the difference between an AI flagging material or trusted flaggers, or where we need to find a way through, because if there is illegal or damaging content, presumably we do want to know about that, and whether and how, to what extent a human needs to be in the mix.
It's so important to have a human decide on the takedown of content, because the legality often depends on the context of the message. For example, one and the same image could be used, shared as a means of propaganda by a terrorist organization, which would make it illegal. But if the same image was used by a press publication, then it would be legal to use this image. And so there is no algorithm, and there is also no artificial intelligence that could ever reliably determine the legality, the context, the intention of a message, or even only the identity posting it. In many cases, it depends on who's posting something, whether it's legal or not. And machines cannot do that. And that's why it's so important to have humans in the loop. And if ever there is a doubt as to the legality, this should indeed be decided by the independent courts, rather than be placed in the hands of moderators who unfortunately often have very little time, who are often underpaid to appreciate the very difficult issue of the legality of the content at hand.
Okay, thank you. And I think you've tackled some of those questions there. So Shana, I have a couple of questions here that I think are probably very much directed at you, but I will take the one there that is probably the most striking, which is, what would you say to those who say that the fight is already over and we've lost the battle against surveillance capitalism?
I would say to anybody who says that, did you pick up your paycheck from Google this week? Because that's exactly what the companies want us to believe. That's what they've been telling us. Look, what have we established in this whole conversation this evening? What we've established is that 20 years have gone by, and surveillance capitalism has rooted and flourished. It is now the institutional intermediary of all internet-enabled action, essentially. How did this happen? Did this happen because democracy has been fighting it tooth and nail every day, week, month, year? No. This has happened because they have been able to do this in an environment essentially free of relevant law. In other words, we have not yet begun the counter-revolution, the pushback, the taking back of the societal frontier. If we had been doing this for 20 years and we were still where we are today, then I might say, well, okay, we've got a real problem. But just the opposite is true. Where we are today is comparable to the early phases of industrial capitalism, industrial civilization, when employers and owners had all the power. There were no workers' rights. There were no consumer rights. Employers and owners had all the power on the strength of their property rights. That was it. And the decades of struggle in Europe, in America, in many other countries that people went through in order ultimately to establish the new charters of rights, the new regulatory paradigms, the new legal frameworks, and importantly, the new public institutions that stand under public law to govern and oversee and enforce rights, laws, and regulations. That's where we are today. So in my country, the United States, it wasn't until essentially the fourth decade of the 20th century that we got those rights and institutions and laws and regulations to protect workers and consumers. The fourth decade, it was the 1930s. We now enter the third decade of the 21st century, and it is my view, and this is what puts the passion in my voice, it is my view that this decade is essential. This is the decade when we begin to shift the trajectory from an authoritarian digital future to a democratic digital future, from one of unaccountable power held by private empires to one of public accountability and democratic governance. But we cannot waste this decade. We cannot fritter it away. We do not have a moment to waste. And that is why I want to be very specific to and come back to exactly what's happening right now in our conversation. Question after question on content moderation. Question after question on what is legal and what is illegal. Friends, these are the downstream issues. And every time we get lost in the weeds of these issues, the surveillance empires celebrate. They want us to be downstream, haggling over the details of their property contract, rather than contesting and confronting an illicit property contract where they have assumed ownership rights, property rights over data illicitly, secretly, uncontestably, taken from what used to be called our private experience. We need to go upstream to the source. We need to be talking about the causes of all of these ills. And the final thing I want to say about this preoccupation with what's legal and what's illegal, legality, as my remarks aim to illustrate, is a moving target. There are things that are legal today, like the massive scale extraction of human-generated data. It's legal, but it's pernicious, it's dangerous. It has led to a series of anti-democratic social harms. It should be illegal. So if we use today's legality and illegality as our litmus, we are inevitably chasing our tails into the past. We need to go to origins. We need to go to first principles. We need to undercut the fundamentals of this economic logic and watch how the other problems begin to recede. Final point, content moderation. It doesn't matter that people say crazy and terrible things. What matters is that those crazy and terrible things get swept up by an economic profit-driven machine, amplified and disseminated and thrust into the center of our lives, targeted so that they can become great obstacles to rational debate, discourse, and thought. So if we go after the principles that I've discussed, beginning with that extraction, the causes of each phase of this revolution, we undercut all of this, which is so preoccupying us now. Upstream, origins, we go to the source.
Thank you, Shoshana. I'm really conscious of time and it is quite late in the day for those of us in Brussels. So I'm going to give everyone a chance to just have a quick one minute or so comment before I hand over to Patrick for his closing. Shoshana, I think perhaps you want to mention something about, we have comments here online about minority rights, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. Also, I would like you to maybe briefly comment on other vulnerable parties like children's rights. If you can do that, I know it's a tall order, in 1 minute, that would be great.
Very, very quickly. I know that children's rights and the relevant clause on children's rights, this has been a subject of some debate. What I want to say here is that there is an incredibly important historical lesson around children's rights. In the 20th century, in the 19th century, child labor reform kicked down the door of the inevitability of the owner's power. You're asking me, is all of this a fait accompli? Is all of this inevitable? People had the same fears in the 19th and 20th century vis-a-vis industrial capitalism. And it was child labor reform that was the first across the threshold, kicked down that door and demonstrated to everyone that their power was not hegemonic, that it could be confronted and new law and new rights could be established. We are in a similar situation today. The second thing about children's rights is that they cut across this political spectrum. Support, understanding, deep, passionate care about children's rights in the online environment, which is to say the same rights that children have in our societies should absolutely adhere in every domain. There is no such thing as cyberspace. There's only capital, people, and machines. So children's rights are a critical opportunity for us to move down the field toward the goalposts. And I'm really wanting to encourage our parliamentarians in Europe to support and drive and innovate on putting children's rights at center stage.
Thank you very much. That was just about a minute, so well done in getting that message across. And thank you so much for your time today. David, perhaps next I could have your sort of closing minute. And I'm going to be a little bit provocative and devil's advocate to you, just even at this late stage, and saying that, of course, we have fundamental human rights, but don't businesses have rights as well?
Thank you for the question. Of course, there's a broad array of fundamental rights. And with reference to the question, if we lost the battle, of course not. But we have to fight every day to protect our fundamental rights and to hold them up. On the difficult notion of legal and illegal, and as was mentioned before, of course, AI cannot do anything on itself. It's only humans using AI. And of course, we are not at the stage where this technology can make any decisions on legal, illegal content, as it's the courts to decide this. But I would like to refer back also to the phrase that is very often used with offline and offline. What is illegal offline or legal offline? Is it also online? I think why this needs to be repeated, this statement, is because the system has changed now. Because of the wide array of data, the different technologies that are used to rank information and so forth, it just appears like a different game. And this is really where we need to increase our understanding. We need to see, like, if the measures, the practices of business are they interfering with fundamental rights, and if these interferences are acceptable and proportionate. And here, I think, what we really need is to get the data, of course, to get a better understanding, like where we are at, because we really lack the knowledge at this stage. And with this data, we can allow for better research that can look into systemic problems and issues, into discrimination online, to get a real understanding where the problems are and where more measures need to be taken. And lastly, this access to information, only this allows then the proper oversight of the companies and of the law. And oversight, as I mentioned before, it needs to be independent, really important. It needs to have enough resources, what we heard before. This also needs the relevant skills that are needed to understand systemic risks and need to be enshrined in law. And with this, I thank you for the debate.
Thank you very much, David. Indeed, things have changed. I always like to say it's the 3 V's, the volumes, the vector, and the velocity. So while we may always have had disinformation and such like out there, our human brains are not necessarily as equipped to deal with the new volumes and vectors and speed with which they're coming at us. Werner, I'm going to turn to you. And on this question of time, perhaps you could give us a prediction on what you think the timeline for the DSA is going to be, or look in your crystal ball and give us some thoughts.
I think I'm pretty optimistic in saying that by mid next year, we will have a political agreement between both Parliament and Council, and then we need a few months or a year probably for the whole digital ecosystem to adapt to this. And if I'm so optimistic, that's due to the fact that we've been having this debate that we also had today, and we've had it in the last 2 years, at least here in Brussels. And I think people gradually start to understand the issues we're talking about. And it is so wonderful that we are having this debate at all, because if, like Shoshana, we want democracies to regain control, well, we also need democratic debate. And that's what we're having here, and that's great.
Thank you very much, Werner. And finally, Christoph, a minute to you to wrap up your thoughts on this afternoon or this evening's debate.
Yeah, I'm very glad that the European Commission and the European Parliament gives a voice to civil society organizations to have the say to participate in the discussion. That being said, I would like to reiterate a point that I mentioned before. If the European Union wants to be a global human rights actor, we need to consider that the DSA will have a role model effect internationally. So it's very important for us to understand the importance of civil justice guarantees to avoid misuse. Otherwise, if the DSA were not designed cleverly, it could set a very dangerous precedent for governments around the world to crack down on dissenting voices, journalists, or human rights defenders. And we saw this happening from the past, and we would like to avoid that this is going to happen again. And related to that question is that the European lawmaker should not be oblivious about the life situation in non-European Union countries. For example, there's a provision in the DSA that says that every platform, no matter the size, should appoint a legal representative. And this obligation would amount to cost of 100,000 euros a year. What does it mean for an amateur provider of services who resides in Peru? And the same holds true when it comes to trusted flaggers. In some countries, it's inconceivable or outrageous to consider that law enforcement units should be trusted at all. So what happens if such trust is normatively determined by the DSA? Those things of question, the international dimension, we would like to see considered. And that's the reason why, together with Access Now, we have kicked off a Global Digital Services Act Human Rights Alliance, which will bring together non-European organization individuals. And we would like to give them a stronger voice in Brussels and an option for them to explain their story and their experiences.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you, of course, for explaining your position and experience. Christelle, I will allow you to have the floor as well. I think Christophe has put out a rallying call there to yourself as rapporteur and the other lawmakers about the need to bear in mind the global impact of what this DSA will most definitely have.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for this very important and interesting debate. I have really enjoyed it. And even though I have been working with this very long now, I still learn new things, and that's really great. Well, yes, we are very much aware that we have an obligation that goes beyond the European Union, and we are definitely willing to take it on us. We hope that goes for the Council as well, because we need to agree with them by the end of the day. But you know, I think it is important that we take back control, democratic control over the platforms and the digital environment. And I definitely hope that we will be successful in that with the DSA. Thank you very much for the debate. And I cross my fingers, and I hope that I will have a support in the Parliament for this line. Thank you.
Absolutely, Christelle. We do hope we'll be aiming for that same timeline that Werner is expecting as well. And Patrick, your thoughts, your closing remarks. I know you've had so much energy for this debate. I hope it's lived up to your expectations.
That's for sure, Jennifer. I think all panelists agreed today that the DSA should be a game changer to the protection of our fundamental rights online. In fact, Shoshana said we cannot afford the DSA not to be. And Crystal also underlined that doing nothing just because it's difficult is not an option. And so some key takeaways from my perspective were Crystal Schaldemose underlining that what's legal offline should be legal online as well, and that personalized targeting of ads is a problem to society that we need to address. David Reichel stressed that transparency is key. Christoph Schmoen said that we cannot allow platforms to be in charge of determining what's legal or not. And Shoshana Zuboff called the massive destruction of privacy online a social harm, and told us not to accept the inevitability of surveillance-based data extraction, but to outlaw it. Now, my Civil Liberties Committee has made some specific and important proposals to safeguard digital privacy and freedom of expression, such as the right to anonymity, limiting government data access, putting the courts in charge, rather than private moderators and error-prone corporate algorithms. And I think that tonight's debate has underlined the need to put fundamental rights at the center of the Digital Services Act. We can see from the audience questions just how much this matters to citizens. And I hope that all experts and civil society and citizens will continue to contribute to this debate, which is so essential to our future in the age of the digital revolution. So I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for their contributions tonight to this debate, which we'll be having in the coming weeks and months. And indeed, let's not wait for decades, but let's be ambitious now.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you for organizing it. Of course, as always, a big thank you to the panelists. It was fascinating for me as well. I really enjoyed hearing from all of you. And thank you very much to our audience. I apologize that we couldn't get to all your questions because there are so very many of them. But as Patrick says, this is not the end of this conversation. We want to continue to have this debate around these really important issues in the weeks and months ahead. On that note, this event has also been recorded. So if you missed a part or you would like to go back and look at something else or you want to share with your colleagues, please do keep an eye out for that. You can see there Patrick's website where you can find more about the post. And I'm sure this video will be shared there in due course. So I'm going to leave you all with my favorite Kranzberg's first law, which says that technology is neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral. So we need to think about what we're doing with it. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.